The radar looked clean. No warning, no panic. No reason to believe that anything in the sky above North Vietnam could seriously threaten the most powerful air force on Earth. Inside the cockpit of an American F-4 Phantom, confidence was almost routine. The mission briefing had been simple. Escort the strike package, drop the bombs, watch for anti-aircraft fire, return home. Enemy fighters? They were considered an inconvenience, not a real danger. Many American pilots had been told the same thing before crossing the border. The MiGs won't stay and fight. They're too slow. They're outdated. They'll run. For months, that belief had shaped the mindset of crews flying some of the most advanced combat aircraft ever built. Then, a calm radio transmission suddenly broke. Bandits, 11 o'clock, low, heads turned. Nothing. Another second passed. Then a tiny silver shape burst from beneath a layer of clouds. It looked impossibly small, almost fragile. For a split second, some pilots thought it was already fleeing. It wasn't. The MiG pulled hard into the formation. A flash erupted beneath its wing. A thin white trail carved across the blue sky. Someone shouted, "Missile." The warning came too late. The explosion slammed into the Phantom with a deep, hollow thump that every pilot in the formation felt through the air itself. Metal ripped apart. Flames swallowed the aircraft. A parachute never appeared. The radios exploded with overlapping voices. "Brake left. Where is he?" Another MiG. Within seconds, confidence turned into confusion. Confusion became fear. The tiny fighters that many had dismissed as obsolete had vanished back into the clouds before most American pilots even understood what had happened. It wasn't luck. It wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of a lesson that would force the United States Air Force to rethink everything it believed about air combat. And the most surprising part, the story was never really about the MiGs. It was about the dangerous cost of underestimating an enemy who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. To understand why those brief moments in the sky mattered so much, you have to go back to the beginning of America's air campaign over Vietnam. By the mid-1960s, the United States possessed overwhelming technological superiority. Its aircraft were faster, more powerful, carried heavier payloads, flew farther, and were supported by an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. On paper, victory looked inevitable. American planners believed sustained bombing would slowly break North Vietnam's ability and willingness to continue the war. The campaign became known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Day after day, wave after wave of aircraft crossed into heavily defended airspace. The expectation was simple: destroy bridges, rail yards, supply depots, fuel storage, factories, force the enemy to negotiate. Instead, the opposite happened. North Vietnam adapted. Roads destroyed during the day were repaired at night. Supplies moved through forests instead of highways. Camouflage became an art. Entire logistics networks seemed to disappear beneath thick jungle canopies. Every successful strike was followed by another difficult mission. The war refused to follow the script American planners had written. Then came another problem. The sky itself was becoming hostile. Surface-to-air missiles forced pilots to fly lower. Flying lower exposed them to anti-aircraft guns. Flying higher exposed them to radar-guided missiles. There was no comfortable altitude anymore. Every mission demanded impossible choices. The pressure on American crews became relentless. Pilots spent hours preparing for flights that could be decided in seconds. One mistake, one missed radar call, one unseen missile, and years of training disappeared in a fireball over unfamiliar mountains. But while American attention focused on missiles and anti-aircraft batteries, something smaller, much smaller, was quietly becoming a greater threat. North Vietnam's fighter force was tiny compared to America's. Its aircraft were older. Its resources were limited. Its pilots flew fewer missions. Everything suggested they should avoid direct confrontation. Instead, they studied their enemy. Every American formation, every bombing route, every radio procedure, every predictable habit. They didn't need hundreds of victories. They needed carefully chosen moments. The North Vietnamese command understood something many larger militaries had forgotten. A smaller force doesn't win by fighting every battle. It wins by choosing the right battle. American aircraft often entered hostile airspace carrying heavy bomb loads. Those bombs made them less agile, less responsive, less capable of sharp defensive turns. The MiGs waited until that weakness appeared. Ground radar stations tracked incoming formations long before American crews realized they had been detected. Controllers hidden far from the front directed fighter pilots like pieces on a chessboard. Every movement had a purpose. Every second mattered. The MiGs rarely searched for targets on their own. The targets were brought directly to them. The attack itself often lasted less than 2 minutes. Appear, strike, disappear, by the time escort fighters reacted. The attackers were already racing toward friendly airfields or hiding beneath cloud cover. It frustrated American commanders. How could such a small air force keep surviving? Why weren't they standing and fighting? The answer was simple. Because survival was part of the strategy. Every MiG that returned safely could fight again tomorrow. Every experienced pilot became more dangerous with every mission. The goal was never to dominate the skies. It was to slowly erode American confidence. Mission after mission. Ambush after ambush. Until even veteran pilots began scanning every cloud, every mountain ridge, every patch of empty sky, expecting a tiny silver fighter to appear from nowhere. And soon, America would discover that its greatest advantage had quietly become its greatest weakness. Fear has a strange effect on powerful armies. At first, they deny it. American intelligence officers gathered reports after every mission. Pilots described the same pattern. The MiGs never stayed. They never fought fair. They appeared without warning, fired, then vanished. Some commanders dismissed the reports. They're getting lucky. They're avoiding real combat. They're afraid. But inside ready rooms across Vietnam and Thailand, the men who actually flew those missions knew better. Luck doesn't repeat itself. Discipline does. The North Vietnamese Air Force was tiny. Its maintenance crews worked with limited tools. Replacement parts were scarce. Fuel had to be protected from relentless bombing. Entire airfields were attacked again and again. Yet every damaged runway was repaired. Every surviving aircraft was hidden beneath camouflage nets or inside mountain shelters. Sometimes mechanics rebuilt aircraft using parts from several wrecks. Nothing was wasted, because every airplane represented something far more valuable than metal. It represented another chance. The pilots themselves came from ordinary families. Most had never imagined fighting the world's most advanced air force. Some had trained in the Soviet Union. Others received instruction in China. They learned different aircraft, different tactics, different philosophies. But they all returned with the same lesson. Never fight America's strengths. Attack its weaknesses. One name slowly began earning respect on both sides of the war. Nguyen Vinh CC. He wasn't the loudest pilot. He wasn't famous because of dramatic speeches. He became dangerous because of patience. While many fighter pilots dreamed about glorious dogfights, he hunted opportunities. He waited, observed, struck only when the odds favored him, then disappeared before the enemy could respond. That discipline would eventually make him one of North Vietnam's highest-scoring fighter aces. But he wasn't alone. Pilots like Nguyen Phim Ton and many others shared the same mindset. Individual heroes mattered. Yet this wasn't a story about lone wolves. It was a system. A carefully built machine where radar operators, ground controllers, maintenance crews, camouflage teams, and fighter pilots all worked together with almost mechanical precision. Meanwhile, American pilots trained differently. For years, military planners believed future wars would be decided by technology. Missiles would replace turning dogfights. Radar would find enemies long before they became visible. Speed would solve everything. That belief shaped an entire generation of fighter design. The mighty F-4 Phantom entered combat without an internal gun, because many experts believed guns belonged to the past. Why carry a cannon if missiles could destroy targets from miles away? On paper, the logic sounded perfect. Reality had other plans. Vietnam's skies were crowded. Cloud layers interrupted radar. Dense humidity affected visibility. Rules of engagement often forced American pilots to identify targets visually before firing. That single rule erased much of their technological advantage. Suddenly, fast jets carrying long-range missiles found themselves fighting at close range. Exactly where the tiny MiGs wanted them, the Americans still possessed superior numbers, superior logistics, superior engines, superior firepower. But superiority becomes meaningless when you're fighting the wrong battle. North Vietnam understood that. Instead of matching strength with strength, it forced America's finest pilots into fights they had never truly expected. And somewhere inside headquarters, a dangerous sentence continued echoing. They're just MiGs. Those 4 words would cost far more than anyone imagined. At first glance, there was nothing impressive about the MiG-17. It looked old, compact, almost outdated. Its swept wings belonged to an earlier generation of aviation. Against the massive F-4 Phantom, the comparison almost seemed unfair. One aircraft represented the latest achievements of American aerospace engineering. The other looked like something history should have already retired. Many American pilots couldn't believe these tiny fighters posed a serious threat. Some even joked about them during briefings. Catch them if you can. They'll never keep up. They'll break apart trying. Those jokes disappeared quickly over North Vietnam. Because appearances lied, the MiG wasn't designed to impress air shows. It was designed to survive. Its smaller size made visual detection difficult. Its lighter weight allowed incredibly tight turns. Imagine trying to chase a motorcycle through narrow city streets while driving a heavy truck. The truck has more power, a stronger engine, better technology. But inside those tight corners, power becomes a burden. The motorcycle slips away. That was exactly what happened in many dogfights. The F-4 could accelerate faster. The MiG could often change direction faster. And in close combat, direction often mattered more than speed. North Vietnamese commanders built an entire doctrine around that fact. They refused long engagements. They refused unnecessary risks. Instead, ground radar watched American strike packages from hundreds of kilometers away. Controllers quietly calculated timing, altitude, speed, heading. Then the order came. Launch. MiGs lifted into the sky only when the opportunity already existed. They climbed rapidly, stayed hidden inside cloud layers whenever possible, approached from unexpected angles, attacked, and escaped. Every mission followed the same brutal simplicity. Do not chase glory. Protect the pilot. Protect the aircraft. Fight again tomorrow. American crews slowly realized something terrifying. The MiGs weren't improvising. They were rehearsing. Every intercept looked almost identical. Every withdrawal happened with remarkable discipline. Every mistake became rarer. That consistency created a different kind of fear. Because random enemies can be predicted, professional enemies become harder to stop every single day. Even when newer MiG-21s entered combat, the philosophy barely changed. The aircraft became faster. The missiles improved. But the strategy remained the same. Stay invisible. Attack unexpectedly. Leave immediately. Every engagement lasted only moments. Yet those moments echoed through every American briefing room. Pilots started discussing cloud formations differently. Escort formations tightened. Radio discipline changed. Fuel calculations changed. Entire missions changed. Not because North Vietnam controlled the skies, but because it had changed the psychology of the men flying through them. And that psychological battle was only beginning. Because soon, the tiny MiGs would prove they didn't need to destroy an entire air force. They only needed to make every American pilot believe they could be waiting behind the next cloud. The first thing the MiGs destroyed wasn't an airplane. It was certainty. Before Vietnam, many American pilots believed the greatest danger came from technology. A radar-guided missile, a hidden anti-aircraft battery, a mechanical failure. But now, every cloud looked suspicious. Every radio call felt urgent. Every quiet moment became uncomfortable. Because silence often came just before the attack, the MiGs never needed to dominate the sky. They only needed to make American pilots believe they could appear anywhere. That uncertainty spread faster than any missile. Mission briefings became longer. Escort formations became tighter. Pilots who had once scanned only their assigned sectors now searched every direction. Fuel burned faster because aircraft stayed at higher power settings, constantly maneuvering. A tired pilot made mistakes. The MiGs understood that. They were fighting minds as much as machines. Ground controllers waited patiently. American strike packages followed predictable routes. The moment a formation committed to its attack run, the MiGs struck. They attacked from above, from below, out of the sun, from behind mountain ridges. Sometimes they never fired a missile. A quick burst from their cannons was enough. Then they disappeared. The entire engagement often lasted less than 60 seconds. Yet those 60 seconds echoed for weeks. Back at American air bases, pilots replayed every engagement. What did we miss? Where did they come from? Why didn't radar see them? There wasn't always an answer, because the North Vietnamese had mastered something simple. Surprise, and surprise, is one of the deadliest weapons in war. By 1967, American commanders accepted a painful truth. The problem wasn't courage, it wasn't technology, it was doctrine. The Air Force had prepared for one kind of war. Vietnam delivered another. Missiles that looked perfect during testing often struggled in real combat. Visual identification rules forced close-range engagements. Large formations created predictable patterns. And every predictable pattern became an opportunity, then came change. Pilots began receiving more realistic air combat training. Formation tactics evolved. Communication improved. Intelligence officers studied every MiG encounter in extraordinary detail. Instead of dismissing the enemy, they began respecting him. That change mattered. Because respect forces adaptation. Arrogance prevents it. One operation symbolized that lesson better than almost any other. American planners finally turned deception against the MiGs. F-4 Phantoms copied the radio procedures, flight paths, and electronic signatures normally used by slower bombing aircraft. North Vietnamese controllers believed another routine strike package was approaching. MiGs launched to intercept. Instead, they flew directly into waiting American fighters. The ambush shocked both sides. For one of the first times in the air war, the hunters had become the hunted. It was proof that the United States had learned. Not because its aircraft suddenly became better, but because its thinking had changed. The MiGs had forced that evolution. Without those painful early encounters, many of those lessons might never have been learned. Wars are often remembered by the largest battles, the biggest explosions, the highest casualty figures. But sometimes, history changes because of something much smaller. A handful of determined pilots, a compact fighter aircraft, a strategy built on patience instead of power. North Vietnam never possessed the industrial strength of the United States. It never controlled the skies for long. Its pilots flew fewer missions, accepted greater risks, and knew every takeoff could be their last. Yet, they proved something every military academy still teaches today. Technology alone does not guarantee victory. Preparation matters. Discipline matters. Adaptation matters. And underestimating an opponent can become the most expensive mistake of all. For the United States, Vietnam became more than a difficult war. It became a classroom. Its air forces rewrote training programs, improved missile reliability, placed renewed emphasis on close-range air combat. Future generations of fighter pilots would benefit from lessons paid for by those who never returned. Those lessons echoed far beyond Vietnam, into every modern air force, into every cockpit, into every mission briefing. A's for the tiny MiGs. They earned something far greater than fear. They earned respect. Not because they destroyed the world's most powerful air force. They didn't. But because they forced it to change. And forcing a superpower to rethink itself is a victory few opponents in history have ever achieved. Remember that quiet morning from the beginning? The American formation crossed into North Vietnam, believing the sky belonged to them. The radios were calm. The confidence was absolute. Someone had joked that the MiGs would never stay and fight. Then, a tiny silver fighter burst through the clouds. One missile trail, one explosion, a few seconds of confusion, and a belief that had existed for years vanished forever. Because on that day, America didn't simply encounter a small enemy. It encountered the danger of underestimation. And once that lesson was learned, everything truly changed.